to have the opportunity to interview with you about an object, a project about how we can address the loneliness about the international students as the newcomers to London. Yeah, as we all know, London is a popular city to study abroad, but the official data shows that nearly 2/3 of international students have the period of loneliness. Yeah, because they are far away from their relatives and familiar environment, and come to a foreign country, and many uncontrollable factors will affect them and make it harder for them to adapt to a new and unknown environment. So, do you have any good opinions on this challenging and critical adjustment stage for the international students?
Lots. Whether they're good or not is another matter. I think it's a really complicated issue, and I think there's probably quite a lot of factors that play into it, some of which I think a university could anticipate or an institution could anticipate. Some that I don't think it's possible to anticipate because they're about an individual set of circumstances. And I guess there's also something really important to recognise about the role of the student too, and what they bring to that scenario, as in how might they prepare themselves to anticipate those feelings, those emotions, and how they might then themselves deal with those. It's not every student who feels lonely, but many students I think do, and I think interestingly there might be an increase in the number of students who feel some form of loneliness. I think it's also probably really important to try and break down what loneliness really means within the context of your research and your study, because I think there's some forms of how a student describes feeling lonely and what they're actually experiencing could sometimes be quite different. I think it's very common for any student, including international students, but students who are from within the UK who are new to London. I think you may feel homesick. You might feel pulled back to where you've come from, wherever that might have been. And that could be quite different to feeling lonely, although it has a strong connection to feeling lonely because you are alone, or you feel that you're alone because you are away from your family, the friends that you know, people that help you to feel more comfortable. So I think that's a very interesting differentiation from a more generalised feeling of prolonged and kind of uninterrupted loneliness. And one might be addressed by allowing a bit of time to adjust and acclimatise. The other might need to be kind of seen as something that perhaps a student needs more support with, or needs to be offered some opportunities to help them form connections that might help them to resist the loneliness. And I guess by that I mean it's not to force a student to do a certain sequence of things, but it's to make clear that there are things, if you wanted to, that you could do that will give you some kind of infrastructure to meet people, make connections, have the chance to feel connected to a new community. And they might be things like what the student union can offer.
I also can chat the student union and the student counseling and the cross-cultural communications member. And but I also think the expression and some communication is a direct and simple way to create a connection with outside. But some of us international students have the feeling of loneliness. They will feel the loneliness as this weakness. And also I think loneliness is a very serious topic, but we must face it that we can have enough energy or courage to deal with it. Yeah, so but some of the international students, they checking back all the time and leave the result to the time. Yeah, so is there any good way to cut into this topic clearly or ingeniously?
Do you mean in terms of how to improve the experience of communication and connection?
Maybe how can we talk about it or cut into this topic and find some way to address this problem, because most of our international students think this serious topic, they don't want to repeat it and talk with others.
Do you mean that you feel that there's a significant number of international students who feel it's something that's private or perhaps a source of shame of some kind, that it feels almost embarrassing to confess to feeling lonely? I think, yeah, it's an interesting question in the sense that I think there's probably a real range of feelings around why you may choose to not speak about loneliness. And I think there isn't just a singular one. So I think it's a very complex issue in the sense of, I think that feeling that you are lonely, I could imagine there are people who feel that's very private, they don't want to share that feeling, although there's a paradox in that, because sharing it might lead to feeling less lonely. But I can also feel too that there are other kind of emotional states that might link to how you end up feeling lonely. They can be to do with, I think, feeling extraordinarily different. So sometimes, this is, I think, especially true for some international students, where language can feel like it's an alienating experience, and the feeling that you're in an environment where you're carrying this extra burden of trying to understand and be who you are within that environment. But there's this layer of language that perhaps has to be broken through, or has to be part of how you feel confident about communicating or not, and that can sometimes contribute to loneliness. I think there's also other things which are to do with situations perhaps where you feel that the course or the decision you've made to study isn't the one that you fully expected. It's not turned out like you thought it might. And I think you can start to feel isolated and feel that sometimes maybe you're regretful, or you feel like the decision you've made puts you in a place where you feel a bit like you're separate or an outsider from the people around you who appear to have made a choice they feel confident and happy about. And that could have nothing to do with language and nothing to do with where you're from. It could be just about feeling extraordinarily different, and that somehow you've made a decision that feels questionable to you. It undermines your confidence, makes you feel withdrawn. So again, I go back to how I was answering that first question. I think that maybe there's something interesting to interrogate about how you're defining loneliness, and whether there's kind of subcategories or categories of things that might be getting confused with loneliness. That to really understand and break through in the way I think you're trying to, I think you had talked about sort of finding ingenious ways to address it. Perhaps it needs to be about understanding the type of loneliness, or what the difference might be between feeling lonely and feeling isolated, or feeling lonely and feeling homesick in the way I suggested before. Or perhaps the difference between feeling lonely and actually feeling alone. Sometimes students can arrive and they find themselves in living situations where they're living alone, they're travelling alone into college, they might meet classmates, but that might be the only
sometimes just
interaction.
Maybe sometimes lonely just a feeling, not just embarrassed or real story, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's practical situations that I think can lend themselves to you feeling lonely.
Yeah.
And they can be very practical things about how you live, what you're studying, what your social life is like, whether you have one. Maybe you're working all the time. That can be quite an isolating experience.
Yeah.
So it's a very big, complex topic, I think.
Yeah. So, and regarding to the sense of disclosure, most of the international students are unwilling to express their feelings. Yeah.
Aren't willing, did you say?
Yeah. Some of the international students are unwilling to express their feelings. Yeah. And in many cases, they will make them lose confidence, and they think that will bother other people, or maybe they think that cannot be understood by different people. Yeah. So, and or even receive negative treatment. Maybe that's just their unhealthy assumption, I think. Yeah. So, do you have any good advice to help them break this crucial cycle of emotions and behaviors?
I think, again, it's probably multiple points of advice. I think there's something about here how the university takes some responsibility for creating an environment where students can feel comfortable and can feel confident that they can speak and raise issues and seek support if they feel their welfare or their well-being is not where it should be. That again becomes a kind of multi-channel issue. So I think it's important that that environment exists through everyone who is in the community of the college in this instance, but the whole university if you like, can understand and be confident about how to say to somebody who might appear to be lonely or might not be actually saying it, but might be indicating through behaviour or body language, or perhaps not being present, not engaging, that something's going wrong. And I think that how you might do that can be as simple as, if I just met you in the street in the middle of the college and you looked a bit low, and I said, "Are you okay?" That sort of very simple human engagement can be incredibly important. But some people find that deeply uncomfortable and wouldn't welcome it. Other people might want to be more anonymous, might want to talk to somebody outside of the college environment and explore their issues in the kind of context of things like well-being, perhaps counselling or other forms of health advice. And I guess what's important is that we try and help students understand all the options they have available to them within the infrastructure of the university whilst they're a student. So that might mean things like the counselling and health advice. For some students who have some form of faith, that might be about them being connected to our chaplaincy services, where there's a chance to connect through a belief system. If you have a particular belief system that brings you reassurance or can make you feel connected to a kind of congregation of people. It might be about, and this is very common I think, it's about looking at mutual interests, which might be about your area of study, they might be about how you work as an artist, a designer, a creative practitioner, but they might be about the thing you love doing, that's your hobby. It could be sport, it could be any number of things. And that's perhaps where somewhere like Arts Student Union really comes into play, because it's an organisation that is about helping students to create opportunities and, well, I guess opportunity is the right word really, opportunities by students for other students. And that can be a really wonderful way to make connections. But I think culturally it's a really interesting question, because the Students' Union don't exist as a phenomenon in every nation of the world. They're very common. Every university would have a student union in the UK for the most part, but that's not necessarily the case in other parts of the world. So I think that sense of how you break through some basic understanding around what a student union is, and indeed around some of the kind of stigma that might be attached to things like mental health, where talking about good mental health as a anticipatory maintenance practice that we all take on. We look after ourselves to stay well, recognizing that if you're feeling lonely, that might be an aspect of you feeling in some ways that your wellness is not where it should be, that you need support, that you want to try and improve that. So it's about recognizing and being able to take action around it as well.
Yeah, I also think the university environment is the most direct and effective way connection, yeah, for the international students. But how can we build the bridge between the university environment with the international students or all the students? Yeah, like the activities or some like the events of the students union. Yeah, between these two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because like some of the students are introverted, you know, they are don't optimistic, so they are not willing to create a new connection with others' activity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so.
I mean, that goes to where I think, to what I was referring to at the beginning about the kind of responsibilities of all parties. This is ideal, and yet we don't live in an ideal world. But in an ideal world, I think we would have a scenario where the university is able to lay out all the opportunities that a student can engage with, and a student takes a responsibility to kind of find and identify the things that would help them the most. That's really easy to say, but actually it's a very complicated thing to achieve. And I think a lot of this is about communication, and sometimes the failure of communication, or sometimes over communication. So I think as an applied imagination student, there would have been a welcome event for you back in January when you started your course. But it would have happened at a point where you were brand new to your course potentially. You might have heard it all in that moment, heard all of this great content, thought, oh, I'll do that, I'll follow up on that, I'll click on that link, I'll find out more about that. But then life takes over. You have your first piece of work to do for your course. Those things you were thinking you were going to do start to slip behind you. You forget about how useful they might be. So there's something about keeping those things present consistently, but also something about trying to help students to see that there are opportunities for them and that they can take a step towards those opportunities when they need to, or perhaps even better in an anticipatory way, so that they can do things that help them to stay well, so that they can resist those feelings of loneliness and they can feel those connections that perhaps feel very strong or feel very absent when you've left where those connections are.
Yeah. Many students mentioned the keywords like the belonging, the well-being, and confidence, something like that. Do you think how many activities or like the university's environment have created or existed for them that can support them to have a sense of belonging or achievement in this learning?
I think there's a strongly held idea that we want to create environments where students feel that they belong. And there's lots of research in the higher education sector in the UK that says belonging is a really important kind of key to why students continue in their studies, why we retain students is the term that gets used a lot. And that also indicates that if you feel that you belong in your course, you will probably perform better academically, you'll probably get better grades, you'll get a better overall classification. So apart from the kind of moral or ethical responsibility to make sure students feel that they belong in their environment, there are other motivators for universities to say, well, if a feeling of belonging contributes to students staying in their studies and doing well in their studies, that helps us to develop our income and our reputation, and those are all motivators for an institution that's as big as one like ours. So I think that feeling of belonging is valued on a number of levels and in a number of different ways, depending on who you're talking to. For me personally, I'm most interested in that moral and ethical kind of impulse to try and create an environment where people feel welcomed and not marginalised and feel that they are part of something. That's a really easy statement to make, but quite a hard thing to do in practice, because much of it relies on a staff body overall, the whole population of the staff in the college feeling the same way and trying to hold up that value really clearly is part of what they do. But really significantly, it's also crucial that students sign up to that proposition as well, because to feel that you belong in an environment is as much to do with your peers as it is with the staff who are leading or teaching you. And I think that's a really important thing to consider around how we create belonging. In some respects, it says that the environment is as supportive as the kind of least supported person feels. That if we've got people who feel marginalised or unsupported, that means there's something not working as well as it ought to. And that, I would suggest, means there's a cultural change that might be required in some scenarios. A lot of the research around belonging indicates that it's the local unit of experience that a student benefits from and feels belonging through. And by that generally means that a student identifies with their course, and that's the first place that they feel they belong to. And in some very large courses, particularly at undergraduate level, students may often actually relate to the level of study they're in, or even to a smaller group of that level of study, where you have a large course, for instance, like our graphic communication design BA. There's around 150 students at least in each level of that course. So you might actually find belonging in a class of 30 rather than in that 150, or in the overall 450 students that makes up the course at any particular academic year. So I think there's something interesting about that unit of experience and how belonging is created in that environment. But all of that said, I think it's easy too for some students to feel that they don't belong in their course environment, and they need alternative places to go to feel they can belong. And that's where things like, again, the union, our wellbeing services, opportunities that exist outside of your course are a really important part of the kind of fabric that we create as an institution that wraps around the course idea.
I have sent email and also interviewed with the student counseling member and the CSM officer, the students' union. But at first, they just asked me the question, and I need to repeat the longest question once again. So we just through the way of the communication and just like the book or written language. Yeah. So how can we break this limitation?
It's something we talk about a lot, actually, because University of the Arts London, as it indicates, should be interested in the arts and should be especially interested in the visual. And that gives us, they're imperfect opportunities, I think, but it does give us opportunities to go beyond language, verbal and written language, and gives us the opportunity to develop forms of communication that focus on image, the visual, that could perhaps cross cultures or cross language barriers in interesting ways. We often theorize this, but I've yet to see a really clear solution to that works in practice. And I think there's some interesting ideas about the contract that's formed when a student chooses to study in an institution like this, where there is a predominant language being used. And I wonder how far we can flex that use of language to recognise more about that kind of visual or image-based forms of expression, but that we could also recognise that in order to teach effectively, we can utilise more than in the English language, but we need to understand and be able to negotiate how language is used and how we can question and challenge ourselves around language. It's a real challenge though, because politically in the UK there is a pull towards us upholding standards of language, particularly at undergraduate level, that mean there is a kind of quite conservative expectation that students will be extremely articulate in writing and in speaking in English language by the time they finish their studies. And that's an obligation regardless of where you come from. It's an expectation set on us. But I think for an institution like ours, it's a bit of a dead end, because actually our strength is actually about other forms of communication. It's about our ability to communicate in multiple ways, often visual and often complex or inter or transdisciplinary. They might use language, but they don't have to. And I think that gives us a space to experiment and push the edges. But I guess there's other constraints at play as well. And some of that has to go down again to the person applying to the institution and their expectations of what it might like to be in a group, to work in a group of students who might have varying levels of experiences of language and their ability to speak and work together. Again, I'm perhaps stepping back into that idea of how peers might support one another, but also about how staff treat students who, on a bad day, staff can be impatient and can want to rush a student through something, and actually a student who's thinking carefully about what they want to say in a language that isn't their first just needs a bit of extra time sometimes. So again, we're back into this space of, I guess, multiple things and multiple skills being needed in people like me, like you, to try and commit to working to make those forms of communication work.
I also did an intervention about how we create a new connection with the different students, and our international students or non-international students, they all realized that like the digital medium, something that tools can help them express their feelings and create a connection with outside. So does our university have any plans or future for the future campus experience or students experience, like create an atmosphere or something like healthy environment to help these students, or maybe students have the negative emotions to support them or encourage them?
Do you mean a virtual environment specifically?
Maybe
Just any environment?
or maybe start in our campus and further outside our campus.
And do you mean something that is a network of students connecting to one another, or are you thinking more of a network that is about students connecting to services, support services?
I think both of them, because I think the sports service is necessary for the students at first, and the university's environment, the network, I think that can be useful for them to socialize with different people or explore more.
So there's two examples. One of them doesn't exist anymore, but it's worth me mentioning it. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but essentially it was an online space, platform where students could post content about things they were doing, people they wanted to find to make a connection to, recommendations they wanted to give about where they lived. Commonplace, it was called. And it's been mothballed now. It doesn't exist any longer. You won't be able to access it, I don't think. But I think it's the closest thing we had to what you're describing. What we found with that as a platform, which existed when I arrived in 2017, I think we stopped using it maybe 3 cycles ago. But what we found is that it was great when people contributed to it, but keeping the contribution going, continuing to seek engagement with it, was quite a high resource. So to try and get students to continue to engage with it, it wasn't something students were going to use after its initial launch. So it worked well for a cycle or so, but after that stage it became less and less used, and it was a bit like a dusty shelf where there was some content and it had just been left there. So like a virtual dusty shelf. What I think I would parallel it to, which does exist and continues this academic cycle, is the companion scheme that has been created by the Student Union. And I wonder if this, in particular, if you don't already know about it, might be interesting to you, because it is designed specifically to try to combat loneliness. And it's something where a student can sign up to this scheme and they're essentially matched. It's a bit like matchmaking or dating, but in a platonic way. It's about trying to form friendships rather than romance, or kind of non-platonic relationships. It's absolutely about trying to make friends, and it creates an infrastructure for that friend making. The union runs it, and they run it on the basis of the criteria that you complete when you apply to be a member of the companion scheme. And they take your application and they then go and try and find somebody else who's registered to the companion scheme to then match you to, so that they can form a friendship. And that might be based on, you might say, I'm a mature student, I've come back to study, I'm in an age bracket that's not the kind of normal youthful student who's studying at undergrad, and therefore they might go out and find a mature student who could be your companion. They might look at other criteria. They might look at people who are interested in a particular area, both interested in ceramics, so the kind of disciplinary link is made. All sorts of different ways that might work. And I think that as a kind of scheme is a sort of network. It creates a network. It's not enabled by virtual platforms especially. It's not a kind of smart, digitally enhanced thing. Quite old-fashioned in some ways, but the idea of it generating connections is, I think, quite interesting. There's also, in other parts of the university, we don't have them at CSM at the moment, but there are quite well-developed peer mentoring schemes, which are essentially a way for a new student to meet an existing student who is usually at another level of study or at a more advanced stage of study. And that person can mentor a new student who has just arrived to help them understand more about what to expect, what it's like to be new, and the kind of things. Basically, it's the chance for somebody to say, I wish I had known, and tell that person who is brand new the things they wish they'd known when they'd been new. There's also a peer-assisted learning scheme, different. They sound similar, but they're quite different things, where peers support one another in their learning activities. So they become teachers to one another, if you like. And that idea, again, I think creates a network perhaps of the kind you're indicating. So those are the things that I think have either existed or do exist now. I think the major warning about most of them is that they only really work when students feel connected to them. And I think that form of connection is often to do with students feeling that they are the creators or authors of that network. And there's something about enabling students to run and form networks quite organically. The kind of magic ingredient when I see network really thrive is usually because that's happened. A group of students or an individual student who has connected lots of students together, they tend to sustain for as long as that group of students is studying. And then dynamics can shift and new students arrive and the dynamic changes, or somebody has a slightly different idea and wants to create a new network. So I suppose I'd point to there never being a single kind of magic bullet that sorts all of this out. I think some of it is about opportunity and will. And sometimes it's the lottery of who you end up in a classroom with. Think about when I was a student in my masters. It was a totally random group of people, but we clicked. And people talk about, they use words like this, they talk about feeling, oh, I really love my class. Everybody's really on board. Everyone really feels connected. But I can think of other learning environments I've been in where I've thought, oh, I don't really feel that click doesn't happen in the same way. And I think we can do lots of things to try and aim to create the moment where the click happens. But it's nigh on impossible to guarantee that that click will happen. And it's some of that is about combination of people that we don't really design or control. Because when we're recruiting students, we're not saying, oh, we'll have you because you will work brilliantly with student X, Y, and Z. It's less curatorial than that. It's much more about saying, well, your application looks great, you look like you're going to be a great student. And then fingers crossed everyone's going to work well together and get along. You can't test that in advance so much. So there's some interesting things there too, I think, about how we create a group of peers when we recruit to a course, and what the responsibility is on a course leader or other teaching staff in that course to help that group then get to know one another and to work well together and to give the right environment for the click to happen. Keep coming back to the click.
That's very helpful. So, like, the welcome week is coming?
Yes.
Yeah.
Any minute.
I will interview many new students. Yeah. And what do you want to say to this international students? Yeah. And in the best way you can think of.
What I want to say to international students, I think the key thing is that I want to think any student, including international students who I think face different challenges, I want them to feel welcome, I want to thank them. I want to thank them for picking us rather than the other way around. And I want them to feel that even if things don't feel that they're going to work out right at the beginning, they probably will. And sometimes being persistent and feeling that sometimes you might go wrong. Sometimes things might not feel great. But actually hanging on, seeking help if you need it, looking for help and support, and trying to stay connected to people. Those are the best things you can do. That way you're part of a community. People often talk about their ID card as being like the symbol of their kind of belonging. And that's true to a degree. It gets you into the building, it gets you over the threshold, it allows you to feel that you're in a special space that you've joined. But it's only really, I think, the quality of the interactions you then have as an individual with the other individuals that you meet that make the material difference to whether you feel that you can survive and thrive in that environment. Which is no small thing. And everybody needs to play their part. And of course everybody doesn't play their part. But if the majority do, that really helps hugely. We often talk about things, it's hard for them not to sound glib sometimes, but there is truth in them. That I think we need people to be curious. We need people to feel curious about one another and to want to form connections. And in some respects, if you think about those and reverse them and think about what the opposite of not being curious and not making those connections, how that might make you feel, that is likely to make you feel lonely, isolated, perhaps marginalised, perhaps not part of something. And I think that sense of seeking connection, that's a burden we should all carry as something we need to do as members of our community, staff and students alike. Sounds very idealistic.
I think the interview is very helpful and efficient. Yeah.
Have we covered all your questions?
Oh, I think I finished my interview, and I think I really sorry for taking you so long.
Oh no, it's a pleasure. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's my honor to have opportunity to.
What are you hoping to do with it all? What do you think you want to do with the interview and the other forms of research you're doing?
Yeah, as an interview research. Yeah,
So what's your aim? What are you headed towards? Because is this your final project?
Oh no,
you're
it's the
developing?
unit 2, and today we need to submit our report.
I see.
Yeah.